You think that voice in your head commenting on your experience is just normal self-awareness? Maslow discovered something unsettling in his research on consciousness and self-actualization. He found that most people live with what he called the observing self, a part of consciousness that watches, judges, and narrates your experience from a slight distance, creating a feeling that someone is perpetually watching you from behind your own eyes. These psychologically developing people weren't just thinking. They were experiencing a split in consciousness between the self that lives and the self that watches the living. The most revealing part? Maslow identified that this observing self serves different functions at different developmental levels, and recognizing its presence is a first step toward either transcending it or being controlled by it. This isn't about paranoia or external observers. It's about the documented psychological structure where consciousness observes itself, creating the experience that you're simultaneously living your life and watching yourself live it. And understanding this internal observer reveals crucial information about your developmental stage and psychological freedom. Not every experience of self-observation is the same phenomenon. There's a critical difference between healthy meta-awareness that supports growth and neurotic self-consciousness that creates paralysis. Maslow observed that some people's observing self function as compassionate witness, noticing patterns, supporting development, providing perspective without harsh judgment. But most people's observing self function as harsh critic, constantly evaluating, judging, comparing, creating anxiety about how they appear to others or whether they're adequate. This internal observer wasn't supporting them. It was attacking them continuously from a position they couldn't escape because it was inside their own consciousness. The pattern he documented in self-actualized individuals was different still. Many had begun transcending the observing self entirely, not through eliminating self-awareness, but through integrating observer and observe into unified consciousness where the split dissolved. This wasn't loss of awareness. It was transformation from divided to unified consciousness. What appears as the same internal observation from outside reflects completely different relationships between consciousness and self depending on developmental level. Real understanding requires distinguishing between meta-awareness that serves growth, self-consciousness that creates suffering, and transcendence where the observer-observed division dissolves. In this video, I'm going to reveal what psychology and consciousness research show about the observing self, the part of consciousness that watches your experience from inside, why it exists, what functions it serves, and how your relationship with it reveals your developmental level. You'll discover the difference between healthy self-reflection and toxic self-consciousness, why some people feel constantly watched from inside while others experience unified awareness, and what the research shows about transcending the observer without losing valuable self-awareness. These are insights from humanistic psychology, cognitive science, and contemplative traditions about the structure of self-consciousness. By the end, you'll understand what that sense of being watched from inside actually is, and whether it serves or limits your psychological development. This isn't a video about paranoia, dissociation, or mental illness, though we'll distinguish those patterns. This is psychology explaining the normal structure of self-consciousness that most people experience but rarely examine. This video is for people who've noticed that constant commentary in their mind, who feel like they're performing their own life for an internal audience, who experience a strange doubling of living and watching themselves live simultaneously. If you felt observed from inside your own consciousness, if you catch yourself narrating your experience as you have it, if there's always that slight sense of watching yourself, you're about to understand what's actually happening in your consciousness and what it reveals about your development. If you're ready to understand the psychology of the observing self, keep watching. Think about what's happening right now as you watch this video. You're having the experience of watching and understanding, but probably there's also a part of you observing that experience, noticing how you're responding, perhaps judging whether you're understanding properly, maybe aware of how you appear sitting here watching, possibly narrating what you're learning. That observing part, that slight distance between experience and awareness of experience, is what psychology calls meta-awareness or the observing self. For most people, this observer is constantly active, watching, commenting, judging every moment of experience. You're not just living, you're watching yourself live. You're not just feeling, you're observing yourself feel and evaluating whether your feelings are appropriate. You're not just being, you're monitoring how you're being and whether it's adequate. Maslow understood that this split in consciousness, the division between experiencer and observer, is a specific developmental stage rather than the inevitable structure of human awareness. It emerges during psychological development, serves certain functions, and in the most developed individuals can be transcended. The psychological weight of living with constant internal observation is profound. You're never fully present because part of consciousness is always watching from slight distance. You're never completely spontaneous because the observer is evaluating and potentially inhibiting. You're exhausted from maintaining two positions simultaneously, living and watching the living. This is a hidden cost of self-consciousness that most people accept as normal because they've never experienced consciousness any other way. Psychological and neurological research provides framework for understanding how the observing self develops and functions. The neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients and discovered what he called the interpreter, a function primarily in the left hemisphere that creates narratives to explain behavior and experience. His research suggested that part of normal consciousness is constantly interpreting and narrating experience, creating the sense of an observer making sense of what's happening. The psychologist Julian Jaynes proposed in his controversial theory that self-consciousness as we know it, the sense of observing your own thoughts, is relatively recent in human evolution and develops culturally and individually. While his specific theories remain debated, his work highlighted that the observing self isn't a given but a construction that develops. The developmental psychologist Susan Harter studied how self-consciousness emerges in children, finding that the observing self develops gradually through childhood and intensifies during adolescence. Young children are less self-conscious. They're more absorbed in experience without the observing distance. As cognitive complexity increases, the capacity to take one's own experience as object of observation emerges, creating the observing self. But this development can become excessive, creating neurotic self-consciousness, where the observer becomes harsh judge rather than neutral witness. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett described consciousness as including what he calls higher-order thoughts about thoughts. The observing self is consciousness taking itself as object, creating meta-awareness that allows for self-reflection, but also for the peculiar experience of being split between observer and observed. Insider knowledge from both psychology and contemplative traditions reveals that the observing self is a developmental achievement that brings both capabilities, self-reflection, self-regulation, learning from experience, and costs self-consciousness, performance anxiety, loss of spontaneity, constant evaluation. But here's what Maslow discovered about the observing self through his hierarchy and his studies of self-actualized individuals. At lower developmental levels, physiological needs, safety, love, and belonging, the observing self functions primarily as threat detector and social monitor. It's watching, am I safe? Do they like me? Am I fitting in? Am I adequate? The observer is in service of deficiency needs, constantly scanning for threats to security, belonging, or esteem. This creates anxious self-consciousness because the observer is always checking for problems. At the esteem level, the observing self shifts to performance monitor and achievement tracker. It's constantly evaluating. How am I doing? Am I successful? Do I look good? Am I measuring up? This creates competitive self-consciousness where you're always comparing yourself to standards or to others, using the observer to judge your adequacy. But at the self-actualization level, something begins to shift. Maslow found that self-actualized people had what he called task-centering or problem-centering. They became absorbed in work, creativity, or problems outside themselves. And during this absorption, the observing self quieted. They weren't self-conscious in the neurotic sense because they weren't thinking about themselves. They were thinking about the task. This created periods of what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi later called flow. Absorb engagement, where the observer-observed split temporarily dissolves. Here's the crucial pattern Maslow documented. As people developed towards self-actualization, the harsh judging quality of the observing self decreased even as healthy self-reflection remained. They could still observe themselves, but the observer became more compassionate, less evaluative, less constant. And in peak experiences, those temporary states of transcendent consciousness Maslow studied extensively, the observing self disappeared entirely. People reported loss of self-consciousness, being completely present, feeling unified with experience rather than watching it. This suggested that the observer-observed split, while normal for most development, could be transcended. The most developed individuals Maslow studied had moved toward what contemplative traditions call witness consciousness or pure awareness, a state where awareness remains but the sense of separate observer judging from inside dissolves into unified consciousness. The Buddhist tradition extensively documented what they call the witness, or the watcher, the aspect of mind that observes experience from apparent distance. Buddhist practice specifically aims to recognize this observer and ultimately see through its apparent solidity. Advanced practitioners report that the sense of being an observer watching experience is itself a construction. Awareness doesn't actually require a separate observer. There can be known without a knower, seen without a seer. This directly parallels what Maslow found in transcendent states. The observer dissolves, but awareness remains, creating unified consciousness. The psychologist Carl Rogers studied what he called conditions of worth, the internalized standards against which people judge themselves. He found that the observing self often functions as enforcer of these conditions, constantly evaluating whether you're meeting the standards you internalize from others. Therapy, in Rogers' model, involved developing unconditional positive regard for yourself, which transforms a harsh judging observer into compassionate witness. The neuroscientist Judson Brewer studied the brain during meditation and found that decreased activity in the default mode network, the brain's self-referential processing system, correlated with reduced sense of separate self-observing. His research suggested that the observing self has neural correlates, and that these can be temporarily quieted through contemplative practice, creating the unified awareness that meditators report. The philosopher Douglas Hofstadter wrote about what he calls strange loops, consciousness observing itself in potentially infinite regress. The observing self is consciousness folding back on itself, creating the sense of someone watching. His work highlighted that this recursiveness is both the source of self-awareness, a remarkable capacity, and of certain types of suffering, the inability to simply be without watching yourself be. Insider knowledge from the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and contemplative practice reveals that the observing self is a construction, useful at certain developmental stages, potentially transcendable at higher stages, but not the ultimate nature of consciousness itself. But here's what research and clinical observation reveal about the different forms the observing self takes, and what each reveals about psychological development. First pattern, the harsh critic. The observing self that constantly judges, finds fault, and generates anxiety. This is toxic self-consciousness that creates suffering. If your observer primarily criticizes, compares unfavorably, and generates shame, this indicates incomplete development of self-compassion and presence of internalized harsh voices, often from early relationships. This pattern requires healing work, developing self-compassion, challenging internalized critical voices, learning to separate observing from judging. Second pattern, the anxious monitor. The observing self that constantly checks. How am I doing? What are they thinking? Am I safe? This indicates operation primarily from deficiency needs where the observer serves threat detection. If your observer is primarily anxious, constantly scanning for social threats or adequacy problems, this suggests safety or belonging needs aren't fully satisfied. The observer won't relax until underlying security increases. Third pattern, the performance evaluator. The observing self that constantly assesses achievement, appearance, success. This indicates operation from esteem needs where self-worth depends on external performance. If your observer is primarily evaluative, judging how well you're doing, whether you're impressive, this suggests esteem needs are still primary motivators. Development requires building internal worth, not dependent on performance. Fourth pattern, the compassionate witness. The observing self that notices without harsh judgment, supports learning, and maintains perspective. This indicates healthy self-actualization where self-observation serves growth rather than defense. If your observer is primarily kind, curious, and supportive, this suggests substantial psychological development. This is the healthy form of the observing self. Fifth pattern, the quiet presence, where the observing self has largely dissolved into unified awareness. You can still reflect when needed, but there's no constant sense of someone watching from inside. Consciousness is less divided, more unified. This indicates transcendence of the observer-observed split while maintaining awareness. If you experience periods of complete absorption where self-consciousness disappears, or if the sense of internal observer has naturally quieted as you develop, this suggests movement toward transcendent stages of consciousness. These patterns are developmental. You likely move through multiple stages as you grow. Understanding which pattern currently describes your experience reveals your developmental work. If you have harsh critic or anxious monitor, your work involves healing and building security/compassion. If you have performance evaluator, your work involves building internal worth. If you have compassionate witness, your work involves continuing growth and potentially exploring transcendence. If you experience quiet presence, your work involves stabilizing this while maintaining functional self-reflection. The observing self isn't one thing. It's a structure that takes different forms at different developmental levels, and recognizing your pattern reveals your current stage and next growth edge. The transformation that occurs when you develop healthier relationship with your observing self or begin transcending it creates immediate changes in how you experience moment-to-moment consciousness. Remember that constant sense of being watched from inside, that exhausting doubling of living and observing simultaneously, that harsh commentary on everything you do. When you develop compassionate observer or begin dissolving the observer-observed split, this dramatically shifts. Your anxiety decreases substantially because you're no longer under constant internal surveillance and judgment. The observing self was generating much of your baseline anxiety through its constant evaluation. When it quiets or becomes kind, chronic stress decreases. Your spontaneity increases because you're not inhibiting yourself based on observers' judgment. You can respond more naturally, speak more authentically, act more freely when an internal judge isn't constantly evaluating whether your response is adequate. Your presence improves dramatically. When you're not watching yourself experience, you're actually experiencing. Colors become more vivid, conversations more engaging, activities more absorbing, because you're unified with them rather than observing them from slight distance. Your relationships deepen because you're actually present with others rather than watching yourself interact while worrying about how you appear. People feel the difference between someone who's really there and someone who's partly watching themselves be there. Your energy increases because you're not maintaining two positions simultaneously. The constant monitoring exhausts consciousness. When it quiets, you have more energy for actual engagement. Even your creativity often increases because creativity requires getting out of your own way, and the observing self is often what's in your way. Flow states, where you're completely absorbed, become more accessible when the observer naturally quiets. Now here's where understanding the observing self becomes practically transformative rather than just intellectually interesting. You cannot force the observer to disappear through will or effort. That would just be the observer trying to get rid of itself, which creates more division, not less. But you can work with it developmentally in ways that either improve its quality or create conditions where it naturally dissolves. First, if you have harsh judging observer, practice self-compassion deliberately. When you notice harsh internal commentary, intentionally respond with kindness toward yourself. This gradually retrains the observer from judge to supportive witness. Kristen Neff's self-compassion research shows this is a learnable skill that transforms internal dialogue. Second, if you have anxious monitoring observer, address underlying security needs. Build actual safety in your life. Financial security, stable relationships, safe environment. As real security increases, the anxious observer naturally quiets because its vigilance becomes less necessary. Third, if you have performance evaluating observer, work on internal worth independent of achievement. Practice recognizing your value separate from accomplishments. As esteem becomes more internal, the performance monitor has less to track. Fourth, practice periods of complete absorption in activities. Engage in flow-inducing activities, creative work, physical exercise, engaging problems, where you become so absorbed that self-consciousness naturally drops. These experiences teach consciousness what unified awareness feels like, making it more accessible. Fifth, investigate meditation or contemplative practice, specifically aimed at observing the observer. Practices like mindfulness or self-inquiry directly work with the structure of the observing self, gradually revealing its constructed nature and creating possibility of transcendence. Sixth, notice when the observer is quiet naturally and intentionally spend more time in those conditions. For many people, the observer quiets in nature during certain activities or with specific people. Recognizing when it's naturally absent helps you understand conditions that support unified consciousness. Here's what Maslow's research and subsequent consciousness studies reveal. The observing self is developmental achievement that brings self-reflection capacity essential for growth, but it's also a structure that can become trapped if it remains harsh, anxious, or prevents authentic living. The goal isn't eliminating the ability to reflect. That's valuable throughout life. The goal is transforming harsh observer into compassionate witness, then potentially transcending the observer-observed split entirely into unified awareness, while retaining the capacity for reflection when needed. The highest development Maslow documented included periods of what he called self-forgetfulness, not loss of consciousness, but loss of self-consciousness, where people were so absorbed in meaningful engagement that the sense of someone watching from inside completely disappeared. They weren't unconscious. They were unified consciousness rather than divided consciousness. This aligns with what contemplative traditions describe as witness consciousness or non-dual awareness. Awareness remains, but the sense of separate observer dissolves. You don't lose the ability to think about yourself. You lose the constant sense of being split between experiencer and watcher. If that internal observer feels like burden, if it's constantly judging, never quiet, making you feel perpetually on stage in your own life, understanding it as developmental structure rather than as inherent feature of consciousness opens possibility of transformation. You can work with it compassionately, address needs it's serving, and potentially transcend it into more unified awareness. The sense of being watched from inside isn't who you are. It's a structure consciousness created during development, and structures can be modified or transcended. In the next video, I'm going to reveal what psychology and contemplative traditions show about the practices that specifically work with the observing self, how to transform harsh observer into compassionate witness, how to create conditions for its natural dissolving, and how to stabilize unified awareness when it emerges without losing functional self-reflection. Until then, notice your internal observer. What quality does it have? Harsh judge, anxious monitor, performance tracker, or compassionate witness? Your answer reveals your developmental work and your path toward greater psychological freedom. Subscribe if you want to understand the complete psychology of consciousness, self-awareness, and the developmental journey from divided to unified awareness that represents the furthest reaches of human psychological development.